Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros, helping students to succeed on all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school in Cleveland, Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test, school, and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 50 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is when should you take the SAT or ACT? But first, let's meet our special guest, Jim Reinish.
Unlike many test prep professionals, Jim Reinish discovered test prep late in life. A graduate of Columbia University's engineering school, Jim had a long and successful career as an executive with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. In the midst of a salary freeze and worrying about the future cost of his children's college tuition, Jim explored additional income sources and found himself at Princeton Review. Jim rose up the ranks at Princeton Review, becoming a site director and a premier tutor. Wanting to impart a more personal approach to his tutoring, he soon began his own company. It grew to become one of the most successful tutoring companies in a very competitive New Jersey market. Eventually, after relocating to Rochester, New York, Jim found Mike Bergen and Chariot Learning. Jim's been working for Chariot ever since, and the rest is history. Welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. Appreciate that.
Jim, I am so psyched to be talking to you today. And Amy will be too once we get rolling. We have a tremendous topic to explore about when to take the SAT or ACT. But before we do that, you've had quite a journey in test prep. Tell us more, please. It's always fun to talk to someone who's been at this as long as we've been.
It's been a long journey. It's almost 30 years now. And I'll be honest, when I responded to that tiny little ad in the newspaper for Princeton Review, and it was, tiny little font in the New York Times classified ads section.
In a newspaper, no less, right?
Yeah, in a newspaper. There was no internet back then. And my wife actually found it, and she said, "Oh, Jim, you should look into this. They're paying $15 an hour for." I'm like, I didn't know anything about what minimum wage was or anything. So I responded to the ad, and I get to this interview. They do these famous group. First, they give you a test. I don't want to show my age or anything, but they gave us the test, like a mini SAT, and I was just looking at math at the time, and I'm banging through all the questions, and I get to quantitative comparison. I'm like, what the hell is this? What am I supposed to do? And I'm staring at the instructions over and over. Finally, it hits me. I go crazy answering some questions. I don't even know if I got them right or not, but apparently I passed because I was sent to the next step of the interview, which is you're all around a table and you have to teach
the group to do something.
The auditions, right? As you know, when I was a manager at Kaplan, I used to run the auditions, and I loved learning those random bits of trivia.
So, Jim, what did you teach the group to do?
I could not think of what to do. I was going over and over in my head. Should I teach them how to change a diaper? How to do it? So finally, I did something. I thought it was kind of lame, but it was about networking. Kind of like 6 degrees of separation. I said, I'm going to pick a couple random people in the room, and I guarantee after a few questions and background, you're going to know each other. And
that's great. Why didn't we should have done an audition?
That was creative.
I would have loved to have learned that.
I taught cross stitch. I taught them how to cross stitch. That was what I did for my interview for Princeton Review. Yeah.
I explained how to hypnotize somebody.
Oh, interesting.
That's a good one.
It worked for all of us. Look at that.
And
now,
so
go on, Jim.
So I passed the test, and as Amy can tell you, the training's incredibly intense. I think it was basically you learned the entire course and you had to teach the entire.
I'm not going to lie. There were many times because like you, it was a part-time job right out of college. Yeah. I was working full-time, but it was a part-time job. And I remember thinking, why am I going through all of this? Like what again, I think for me, it was $12 an hour, by the way, 12 or 15 in Cleveland. But it was like, why am I doing this? Because it was very intensive. And I remember I still to this day think, never say no to a challenge because it was challenging, but it's the best challenge I've accepted in my life. Right. Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting because when it's all over, and actually there's still one more day of training, but they had to get the schedule in. So they have call-in night. You call in to see if you got assigned to a site. So I nervously call in, and I'm assigned to a site in Middletown, New Jersey, that was maybe 20, 25 minutes from my house. Do you know, I actually said no.
Too far.
My wife is looking at me, what are you, crazy? You just spent 40 hours. You have a massive headache every night from this. What are you? I call them back and I say, okay, is it too late? No, because they were desperate for math tutors. And I accept it. We still had one more night of teachbacks. I bombed the next night of teachbacks. I forget the question, but there was some kind of question that nobody could ever explain the answer. And I was just like everybody else. And somehow that, whatever, I was already assigned and they couldn't change anything. So I teach my first night. I'm kind of nervous. As you know, Princeton Review does all sorts of stealth teacher evaluations. They ask the students, they call the parents, they watch you secretly, whatever it is. A week later, the site director calls me over and says, Jim, got to talk to you. Your students say you're boring.
That
was
a shocker.
That is not.
That was the last time anybody said that I was boring.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, I can vouch for Jim. He is not boring at all.
A couple years later, my wife, I was a site director at this point, and so the site director has to bring in soda and juice. And
yes, you were like the cruise director of the class, right?
Exactly. And so I'm running out of time. So my wife Lisa actually does me a favor and brings everything for me. And I'm already doing the ranting and raving site director lecture. We have a half hour to basically get them motivated for class. She walks in with my kids. So this is 1996. So my son was like 11, my daughter was 8, my younger daughter was probably 5 or something. We're in this gigantic church and I'm running around the room screaming, going crazy. They're like, what happened to daddy? Who kidnapped daddy? What's going on here? And, as I said, the rest is history.
I love that you say a church. I also site director at a church. Like they rented out these little places, these random places and communities, and that's where they would run their classes. Yeah, I forgot about that.
All right, I got to cut in. We can't just revisit our glory days. We need to talk about testing timelines because, one of the things is that we all started at a time when there was a very clear testing paradigm about when to take the SAT or ACT. What was that paradigm that most of the individuals that are parents now grew up with?
Take it once at the end of your junior year.
That's right.
Maybe you take it again in the fall of senior.
To see how you do, right?
May or June, right? May or June, end of year. Mm-hmm.
And then take the test.
And maybe you didn't prep back then, right?
No.
A
lot of the time that was your first taste of it. You're like the PSAT didn't even count. Take the SAT or ACT at the end of junior year. Only take one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take both, and then decide what you're going to do.
And then prepping became what you did in like June, July, August, September to take it again, right?
So when I was in high school, you took it once. That was it.
One and done. That was back in the day.
I had a girlfriend 3 years later. She takes it twice. I'm like, what's going on here? And then she was she had Kaplan. Kaplan was the only game in town at the time. And I was like, test prep? It's just a stupid test.
But interestingly, there have always been test dates throughout the year, right? We know that the SAT, right, is March, May, June, August, October, November, December, right? And ACT is February, April, June, July, September, October, December, right? And sometimes a few more if you take a school day, possibly, right? There might be an extra one thrown in there for you for SAT. So there's a lot of tests throughout the year, aren't there?
Well, right. Back in those days, there were no school day, at least in our part of the country. So does that paradigm work anymore? Because everybody comes with that and parents have it in their head that that's what they're going to do, or that's what their kids are going to do because that's what they did. Does that make sense in the 21st century? What do you guys think?
No, I mean, I think, well, for the kids are way busier than we ever were back in the day. You know, back in our day, maybe you did one sport, maybe two sports, but and then maybe you're in one club. But nowadays, these kids are so busy. Well, you know, I used to get phone calls 2 years ahead of time. Mom
Right.
and dad are scheduling. We heard you're really good. We don't want to miss out. What do we do? What do we do? And it's just gotten crazy.
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's interesting because back in the old days, if you were, say, a soccer player, right? You had one season. You didn't
Right.
play soccer
Right.
4 seasons, right? You didn't do multiple clubs at the same time and then have to go in for conditioning, and your coach had you for 20 hours in the off season. You had your season, and maybe you played multiple sports because you were an athlete. Your point about the amount of programming kids have today.
As Mike knows, I just finished tutoring a boy who's an ice hockey phenom, and mom, dad, and the assistant all thought they had carved out a perfect time to tutor him. This is going to work. He knows, et cetera, et cetera. It does. Then there's it's not just the school team, it's the club team, it's the tournaments, it's the conditioning, and it's just a disaster.
And you're not just really going to take the test necessarily one time. So, right, like now you get into a situation of, if you take the test, you're going to probably want to take it again. Like, I mean, to me, it's like, you got to do it at least twice, because you never know if you got the score you want the first time, why not try for a second? But the other thing too, I would say, when outside of activities, is just academics, right? The workload, the AP load, like taking APs can eat up a certain chunk of the year.
Or IBs, right? If
right.
you're
Or
in
IBs,
that line.
Or what curriculum you're taking, right? It could be that you've taken all the math you need, possibly by the end of your sophomore year, which means why not start taking the test sooner? You know, so all of these things make it like a situation where you really do have to plan out when to test.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing to your point about academics, because it's really good, that inevitably, if a teacher falls behind, then it all rolls into the spring. In that, if we think about just how class load works, students are naturally less busy. They have less homework. The pace of instruction is more relaxed in the fall and the winter. And then as teachers start realizing how far they are behind in order to hit the course objectives, they just start piling the work on. Is this something you guys experience as well? Because I just think it's so common.
Yeah. I mean, it's in our day, I think taking a May, June made sense. Now it's really challenging for students to take a test in May or June, given, like you're saying, Mike, with the academics and just the amount of workload at the end of the year. It's when students are the most stressed.
I'll go out on a limb and say that the June test dates are probably the worst time for kids to test.
Except the only thing I say about June is math. For some of our students, they're finishing that, they're at the end of the year, they're preparing for that final, and they're never as ready for the math, really, I think, is that they're at the end of June. That doesn't mean the same thing for other sections, but that is where at least some things are more optimal.
Only if they aren't ahead in algebra 2, right?
If they're not really
if they're on regular track.
I think math is the biggest driver right now, because I mean, reading, as we all know, if they haven't been reading for fun for a while, nothing we're going to do is going to change that. Which means, honestly, I think you could teach reading any time of the year, as long as you teach it right and work towards your students' strengths and weaknesses. It works, and the same thing for grammar. It's all here somewhere. They just have to extract it.
It's not like high school teachers are reviewing punctuation rules.
But interesting. And I'm probably going out of order on questions you might ask, but I've been thinking a lot lately. Oh, the summer is a great time. You have this August SAT, you have the ACT in July. It works so wonderfully. The students aren't busy, assuming that they don't have summer club tournaments and all that. As Mike knows, lacrosse is the big thing up by us. I don't even understand lacrosse, because I'm from Jersey. But I thought summer would be great. I've had an interesting situation where I've had a not, and this has been smart students and weak students, because they're not doing any math at all. They're suffering on the math questions. It's really, it's just the
Oh, see,
Well,
that's
that's-
why
Mhm.
that's why I think that summer is the best time to prep, because not only does it fit into the schedules for these really busy students, and I'm talking summer going into junior year, but it helps stave off brain drain,
Right. The learning loss, or
right?
just kind
Because
of,
if you don't stay ahead of that, then they're still going to struggle for that August date, which is, it wasn't around 5 years ago, but that August SAT date is really popular, and the September ACT.
yeah. And that's also weird too. You know, we didn't have those summer test dates before. And at least you can see why students, the summer is great, is because if you do the prep in the summer, you can have this out of the way either before you begin your junior year, or certainly if you're after junior year, before you start back, and things are never as busy as they are for a senior who's doing applications, activities, extra, you know, everything that makes it really challenging if you're coming back thinking you're going to prep or test again in October of your senior year.
I hate doing fall prep.
I find
Well,
it very
do you hate
stressful.
doing fall prep for the seniors, or
Seniors.
juniors, or both?
For
Yeah,
seniors.
For seniors. So this is a good, so I'm glad you said that. The philosophy that I share, and Jim's heard this 1,000 times, with the families that contact us, is to say, all things being equal, students should prepare and test as early in junior year as makes sense for them.
Mhm.
Obviously, as makes sense for them are the details we're talking about. But the junior year piece, very often families are like, well, wait a second, I can only do it in junior year. And I say, no, of course you can test in senior year, but think of the stress. Think of the fact that if you waited till senior year to prep and test, then everything's on the line. And think about the fact that the deadlines, you only have a handful of tests if you want to go early action, early admission. You only have the August SAT, the September ACT, and the October SAT. You
Right.
can't even submit the October ACT for early action. That's
Yeah.
a lot of pressure if you waited until the last minute,
Yeah.
right?
And you've got to be very much aware of those deadlines come fall, because the clock runs out on you, and you could realize you miss scholarship deadlines, because a lot of financial aid deadlines now are like October 31st, November 1st, and they may mean you need to have your test scores in before those times. Now it is probably worth mentioning when we talk about picking test dates. One of my favorites, of course, would be picking test dates where you can get a copy of your test and answer. So for example, on the SAT, the QAS, you know, question and answer service, it's nice if you test in March, May, or October. So you can get your test and answers back online. Or the ACT, right? You can get your test information release, which is April, June, or December. So we in Cleveland very much advocate for December testing of juniors.
Which
to
is
launch.
nice, of course. But all things being equal, if I'm ready
If you're
for
ready
the
in
September
September,
ACT, take it.
Yep, exactly.
Now, what are those? So, okay, so if we agree that earlier is better in junior year, depending on the student, what are the factors that should drive the August, September? Because I like to group SAT and ACT together for those students who are going to take both, because many students do equally well on both. So we look at August and September, October and October, the oddball November SAT, those December tests, which Amy, you say December is a great time, especially for the ACT.
Mhm.
Or you've got February, March, April. What are the things that you keep in mind, you take into consideration when you advise students to look at some of those tests?
I think maturity and the commitment they're willing to give. And look, I've had some students who I think they started planning in 7th grade without their parents' help. They're just so self-motivated. But I'll get a student in the summer who's just finished sophomore year, and I'm thinking to myself, if by some miracle I get this person a good score, how the hell are they going to survive college? They're just not mentally ready. I had a long discussion with a parent because she was trying to decide when her child should start. And I convinced her, because once she told me more about him, I convinced her, wait a while, because he's just not there yet.
And that's what's interesting, right? There, you can advise either way. I find for me, because we know that so many of our students may suffer from anxiety. And what I tell parents is that could even go two different ways. Your student could be so nervous and anxious that testing early and often is what provides them with reassurance and building confidence, in which case they might start earlier. But you may also have a student who's so nervous and anxious that you do want to capture them where they have to do it as few times as possible, in which case you might push it off because you feel like, no, we want as much time so that they have the greatest success. And so that's less nerve wracking. But I think to your point, Jim, motivation, right? You know, unless you're willing to put in 100%, like there's nothing that you can say, I'm going to do 10% now, 20% next time. It's like, I do tell parents, if they're willing to put in the 100% of effort, anytime's a good time, right? Because we all know you put in the work, the effort, you should get the return on that time.
And, sometimes, and I can understand this as a parent, sometimes the parents are hoping to not have to make as much of an investment in prep. And so they're hoping they can get it all done in a month. And
now, speaking of investments, you made me think of something, which is scholarships, because sadly, the last couple of years, we've seen families who didn't think much about testing, obviously with test optional. The student didn't do test prep. Maybe the student didn't even take a test. And now all of a sudden it's March of senior year and they're looking and realizing there were a certain amount of dollars on the line. So I do encourage families, please research what monies may be available based upon a test score, because that's a lot of money you can leave on the table if there were dollars attached to a particular test score and you could have started earlier to get that score, to get that money.
I'm also seeing that it seems that students are making the college trips earlier and earlier. Sometimes they have older brothers and sisters, which helps, but as a result, you'll get a kid starting in the summer who's gung-ho, I want to go to Harvard, I want to go to Penn State, whatever it might be. And it makes the schedule a disaster, but also this, as you know, the students are so upset if they don't get into that school or don't get the score they need, that it gets really messy, which is why also talking about fall for a senior, because now they're really desperate, because now everything's on the line and they're going to take it a third time, a fourth time, whatever it might be. And I get scared.
But yeah, that point about wanting to get testing in before the school visits is important. And, in some parts of the country, students get one spring break. In lovely upstate New York, students get both a February, like a winter and a spring break, which means multiple opportunities for school visits. And either they go into those school visits with a sense of where they're scoring and that's comfortable, or they're on the visit and it's a wake-up call, and then suddenly they come back and we are literally getting calls right now. We just went on our visits and we want to test in June. What can we do?
Right. Yeah. No, the campus visits can be very helpful. So you have to think about that, because to me, it would be very frustrating to go on a campus visit with no sense. Is this a fit? Like, is this a possibility for my student? And it's like we say about test driving. You want to make sure, like, if you can spend the money for a college, right? We've talked about, Mike, like, don't let your kid visit a school that really isn't realistic, because that would be very disappointing, I think, to be putting that in front of them and then realize that was a wasted visit because they don't have the scores for that school.
Or motivational, right? Like two different things.
Depends how you look at it. Exactly, for sure.
So you said earlier that math was definitely a driving factor. The level of math that a student had studied should be a driving factor in when the student should test. I'm going to offer up a controversial take, and I'm going to ask you guys to respond to it. All right. In my opinion, if a student is not on the accelerated track, then a student should not allow Algebra 2 to hold them back from scheduling an earlier test if other considerations suggest that the student just won't have time to test later in the year. What do you guys think of that?
I'm okay with that because I think there's enough on the test that they've learned prior, Algebra 1, pre-algebra even, that I can probably teach them what they need to know
Right.
on the Algebra 2 end, and they'll survive. Now, if it's the ACT, a little bit more of a problem because there's so many oddball random things on the ACT, but they could learn it.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, a student who is not accelerated in math should not be expecting a 95th percentile math score,
Exactly.
right? I mean, that's the thing, is that so much of the math is the arithmetic, the algebra, the geometry.
The vast majority is very foundational.
The majority is foundational, yeah.
And like you said, Jim, you're right. There are oddball topics, but are they going to make the difference even for a really high score to not get the goal score? I always go, and remember too, if you look at, is your college is super scoring, then maybe that piece is not the thing that's going to hold you back, because you are going to test again and maybe that score will come around. So I think those factors should not preclude somebody from saying, oh, I'm going to wait a year. Now, what I would say is, I am not an advocate of giving your student the SAT or ACT in freshman year, in sophomore year. I do not promote the notion of just have them take it every year for like 6 years. That I'm not a fan of at all. The score does not just improve by virtue of taking it over and over.
That's where practice tests come in, because a lot of times some families want to get ahead, at least to find out where students are. And if we can offer them a strong simulated test experience without all of the hazard and stress of an official exam, they can get that. I think about what you guys said about maturity, and I've encountered sophomores. I actually recently encountered a freshman who, well against conventional wisdom, was absolutely test ready. But sometimes they are way ahead of the curve. We certainly encounter our share of students that are way behind the curve in terms of motivation and maturity. And sometimes you get those students that are ready and they're accelerated enough that, should they take the test when they're done with Algebra 2, or should they wait till they're done with Calc BC?
I've had some students who have completed Algebra 2, they're in pre-calc, but the pandemic has had a very interesting impact. We'll be covering what I think is a pretty basic Algebra 2 concept, exponents, something pretty basic. And they're like, we didn't learn that.
Yeah, like, we didn't learn that. We skipped that chapter.
And so, of course, we have, I even say that, blame it on the pandemic. It's COVID's fault. But I don't know if remote learning, I mean, I think we do a great job of remote learning, but I think remote learning in our high schools has gotten very interesting in terms of math. So
they either don't remember they learned it, or it wasn't, or they didn't. It's hard to know what the decision the teacher made.
They were playing video games when the teacher did it. They had, there's so many reasons, right? That it's hard to believe that you might skip something that fundamental, but then again, a lot of interesting things happened during the pandemic, and we're trying to claw back that time.
But it points out to what Mike was saying before, that it almost doesn't matter what level of student they are, because there are just certain math techniques you're going to have to reteach.
And that presumes preparation, right? Like our advice assumes that a student is going to prepare for the test. If you're not going to prepare for the test, well, what does it matter when you take it? Right? Take it as late as you want and live with the consequences. But if people are thinking about when should you take the SAT or ACT, they're thinking about what I think is really important. When can a student and his or her family find 2 or more months leading up to a test date where a student can sit for this exam and focus without being burdened by a ton of other academic and extracurricular commitments?
And one last thing I would mention too, the idea of retesting. Be careful, because you almost want to do retest back to back, right? You don't want to test in March and then say, well, I'm not going to test again until October. So do keep in mind that as best you can sometimes, that 1-2 punch, one back to back. Although I will say I'm not a big fan of going from like May SAT to June SAT, because you don't know your scores, but at the same time, the closer you can retest, that is going to be optimal for the student.
I went through this just a few hours ago. I had a student who did very well in the February ACT, honestly, way better than I thought he would do because he never took a practice test with me. And I thought I was done. Mom sends me an email about a week ago. He's taking the May SAT. When do we start? Okay. Fine,
You do
whatever.
have a calendar, Mom.
Yeah. So I checked back on my notes that he got a 36 in reading. So, no issues there. Math was his weak point. So we're going over of course, he didn't do anything to prepare for this morning, naturally.
Right.
So I figured I better teach him some no calculator math because that's going to be probably the toughest thing for him. And we go through about 10 questions. I don't think he remembers anything about anything. It's because it's a 3-month gap.
Test
Yeah,
prep
so that
can be very
1-2
much
punch.
it's test prep can be use or lose. So don't think for a second, parents, that whatever your kid learned 3 months ago for test prep, that they're still going to retain 3 months later. Yeah.
All right. To summarize, students should test when it makes sense regarding their level of maturity and motivation, regarding their academic ability in line with the kind of scores they're hoping to earn, and in consideration of all of the different extracurricular, social, and maybe even work commitments that they're going to have. And then you make a plan, and obviously you prepare before you test. I had to summarize it because it's obvious that we could and probably would talk about this all day. Unfortunately, we are out of time.
I have dinner plans for today. So.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Jim.
My pleasure. I had fun.
If listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Jim@chariotlearning.com.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Tests and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.